Hello, my name is Micah Johnson, and today we'll be analyzing the book Aren't I a Woman by Deborah Gray White. In this analysis, we'll be looking at three main things, discussing resistance, survival, and community building within different slave communities in the antebellum South. As said in the intro, we'll be discussing three main topics, that being under theme 2, resistance, survival, and community building. Before going into depth, we should go over the different kinds of resistance. The first kind is active resistance, and examples include rebellions, revolutions, smaller armed resistances, mutinies, and escape attempts from plantations. It should be noted that in many cases, active resistances were pretty unsuccessful and didn't amount to much of anything, though there were a few exceptions, that being things like the Haitian Revolution and even the Stono Rebellion, which was a semi-success. Now, let's move on to some specific examples seen in the book of active resistance. The first is the Bristol Slaver Incident. In our quote to the bottom left, we can see that it says, in another incident, in 1785, the captain of the Bristol slaver was attacked by a group of women who tried to throw him overboard. This shows us what a little bit of this resistance looked like. It was a mutiny by the slaves that were carried in this slave trade ship. Another incident was the Roberts Ship Revolt in 1721. Like our first incident, this was when a group of women helped another group of men, slaves, revolt against the ship captains and ship crew. Another attempt at active resistance was a Kentucky slave escape. This was when a Kentucky slave and their children escaped the plantation successfully by crossing a river from their slaves. Masters. Another example of active resistance would be the Maria, who was a slave, escape. And she and her 7 children successfully escaped from a plantation and made it to free land. As mentioned earlier, active resistance was hardly ever successful in most cases, and oftentimes just led to more punishment for the slaves as they were caught actively resisting. But a more successful approach to resistance was done passively. Some examples of this actually include surviving, preserving their culture, and working slower. Some specific examples seen in the book of passive resistance include the following. Slave women would often raise children with little assistance from men, which was a trait of preserving their culture from Africa. You see, in Africa, many times the men wouldn't actually help raise the children as much as the women would, who would take the main role of caregiver in childbirth. Another example would be slave families. Now, these slave families would grow over time and they would interact with each other, since the slave men would usually get married to slave wives and eventually end up having kids, which would grow the slave population on many of these plantations. And having these families was growing the amount of African Americans that lived in America, which was honestly frightening to many Southern planters, since they didn't want to necessarily have this great slave population growth, because a lot of the time they were scared of armed rebellions. That was a huge fear of many of these Southern plantation owners. So the growth of Southern slaves was really scary for many of these different slavers and was a great example of passive resistance. Another example of passive resistance was just singing songs and gossiping around a campfire. You see, in many of these cases, these slaves would sing slave songs that would say things of escaping at a certain date, or that would just boost the morale and not break the spirit of these slaves that were working on this plantation. And in many cases, you could find the women and the men doing this. When gossiping around the campfire, that was mainly done by the women. After a days of work or anything like that, they would come together and sit around this campfire and discuss different things, whether it be about the masters or just about themselves. And this would also increase the morale that these slaves held. In the quote to the bottom left, it says, they, referring to slave women, cemented their mutual bonds at the end of every meeting when they walked around shaking hands, singing, Fare you well, my sisters, I am going home. And this is just one example of the songs that they might have sang. To end off this analysis, it should be said that Aren't I a Woman is a phenomenal book and does a great job at explaining how these different slave communities in the South were impacted by the slave trade and by slavery in general. It should also be mentioned that I didn't know nearly as much stuff as I knew about the South and slavery as I know now, since this book has gone over so many different things like resistance, but also gone over stuff like how the slaves reproduced and how they were just impacted by these slave masters. It should also be said that this book can be compared to another book called Revolutionary Mothers, which is something else we had to analyze earlier. While Revolutionary Mothers took a broader approach to talking about women's history and talked about more different races of women like white, black, and Indian, Aren't I a Woman takes a more specific approach, talking specifically about black women and slaves, and only going over really mainly the antebellum South.